Hi everybody, it's Annie again. Are you ready to hear the last few chapters of Ivy and Bean, Book 1? I am. I can't wait to see what happens. Remember, when we left off, Bean was helping Ivy get all ready in her witch outfit so they could put the dancing spell on Nancy. As I read, don't forget to visualize. Make some pictures in your brain of what's going on. That'll help you really understand the story and have a chance to make that movie in your own head, right? Imagine it the way that you want to think about it. The next chapter is called Easy Peasy. I've heard kids say that. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Now they were ready to begin. Ivy went to the bedroom section of her room, and she pulled a cardboard box out from under her bed. Then she looked at Bean. "This part is really secret," she said. I promise I won't tell anyone," said Bean. Ivy opened the box and took out a square thing wrapped in a pink, silky cloth. Are you imagining? It was her spell book. Bean thought a spell book would be mysterious looking, but this spell book was plain black. It was old though, Ivy said, almost 100 years old, and the pages were yellowish. "Where did you get it?" Bean whispered. "My aunt gave it to me," said Ivy. "Is she one? A witch?" asked Bean. "She says she isn't," said Ivy, "but I'm not so sure." Ivy flipped through the book for the dancing spell. She read it to herself, and then she whispered it, but so low that Bean couldn't hear. But Bean didn't mind. Everyone knew that witches' spells were private. After a few minutes, Ivy said, "Got it. It's a pretty easy spell. The only thing we need is worms." Luckily, there were tons of worms in Bean's backyard. Tons. But now they were going to have to sneak into Bean's yard and dig them up without Nancy seeing. But luckily, Bean knew how to get into her yard by going through all the other backyards in Pancake Court. There was one really gross dog poopy yard, and there was Mrs. Trance, who did not like kids in her garden. And also, there was a lot of climbing. But aside from that, Bean said, it was easy peasy. Ivy put the big black book into her backpack, and Bean tucked the wand into her back pocket. It was still a little drippy, but there was nothing Bean could do about that. Ivy's mother was still working in her office, and they slipped past her door like quiet ants. Can you imagine them going down the stairs like quiet ants? Bean's got that wand in her back pocket, and it's still drippy with glue and glitter. And Ivy's got the book in her backpack. Soon they were moving quickly toward the back fence. Ivy, Bean saw, really didn't know how to climb a fence. She just sort of jumped at it, hoping that she would get to the top. So Bean showed her how to find the little holes and bumps to make a ladder. I'm wondering if you're picturing all of those connected backyards in that circular cul-de-sac. It's a street that ends in a curve. I'm going to show you the picture, just in case you haven't ever seen one. Maybe this is kind of what you were imagining. So there's the street that's kind of round, called a cul-de-sac. There are all the houses in a semicircle, and behind them are the backyards. Can you see the dotted line that shows the path they're going to take? We're going to start over here at Ivy's house and go all the way over to Bean's. They have to pass through all those backyards. Wonder what's going to happen. When they got to the top of the fence, Bean whispered, "This is Ruby and Trevor's house. They have a good sandbox. The good news, was that there was a gate on the other side of Ruby and Trevor's yard. The bad news was that it led to the really gross dog poopy yard. Bean and Ivy walked on tiptoes, but still, Ivy stepped in some. Fester, the dog whose poop it was, came out to sniff them. He was a nice dog, and he seemed sorry that his yard was so disgusting. Even a dog could look sorry. The next fence was low and easy, except that the wand fell out of Bean's pocket, and she had to go back and get it. Then came Jake the teenager's house. There was lots of loud music and bad words coming out of the garage. There was no way that Jake the teenager was going to hear them walking across his backyard. Mrs. Trance's yard was next. Getting into her yard was no problem. Ivy and Bean climbed over the stone wall and dropped down onto her lawn. Everything in Mrs. Trance's yard was neat. Her tulips were lined up in perfect rows. Her apple tree was tied so that its branches grew flat. Her bird bath had no birds in it. "If Miss Trance sees us," Bean whispered, "she's going to be really mad." Bean knew this garden. It was very long, and there was no way to go around it. "Is she going to be so mad she throws rocks at us?" asked Ivy. She looked a little scared. "No, she just talks, but it's actually worse than throwing rocks," Bean sighed. "Maybe she's not home." Do you think she's home? Miss Trance was home. They were halfway across her perfect yard when she came outside. She stood on her patio and she glared at them. "Bernice," she said in a high voice, "come here." Bean took a few steps toward the patio. "Closer, please, Bernice. It seems we have to have another one of our little talks." Can you imagine what her face looks like? Visualize and see her, a mad lady who doesn't want them crossing her yard. Ivy came and stood next to Bean, next to the patio. "Who are you?" Miss Trance asked, frowning at Ivy's white witch face. "My name is Ivy," said Ivy. "Well, Ivy, children are not allowed in my garden. Maybe you can teach your friend Bernice that." Miss Trance gave a short, dry laugh. "Because Bernice does not seem to be able to remember it by herself. Do you, Bernice?" I remember, Miss Trance, but this is sort of an emergency," said Bean. "I'm sorry." Usually, when you say you're sorry, people say something nice back. Not Miss Trance. She said, "I don't think you're sorry, Bernice. If you were sorry, you wouldn't keep coming in my garden, even though I've asked you not to. Do I need to call your mother again?" She smiled in an unfriendly way. Bean heard Ivy sucking in her breath. She's about to do something, thought Bean. I think I'm going to throw up," Ivy said loudly. "Ooh, yuck," thought Bean, whirling around to see. Ivy looked at her and crossed one eye a teeny bit. Bean looked closely at Ivy, and then she said, "That's the emergency I was trying to tell you about, Miss Trance." Miss Trance started to look worried. Ivy burped. Ugh, it sounded horrible. Mrs. Trance jumped back. Go home, run." "That's what we were trying to do, Mrs. Trance," Bean said sweetly. She was having a very good time looking at Mrs. Trance's face. "Go, now!" yelled Miss Trance. Ivy gagged. Miss Trance ran inside her house and looked at them through the window. She waggled her hand to shoo them away. "We'll be going now, Miss Trance," called Bean. She waved goodbye as she and Ivy walked away. Ivy gave one more disgusting burp, just for fun. Bean tried to hold her laps in, but they started to come out her nose, and then Ivy couldn't hold her laps in either. It was a good thing they were in the next yard by then. It really was easy peasy after that. They went across, Kalia's yard. Kalia was in her high chair at the kitchen window. She waved her spoon at Bean, and Bean waved back and put her finger to her lips. Shh, she whispered. Hey, I'm going to read that little part just to get one more time because I want you to see if you're really paying attention to the words and visualizing who this character Kalia might be. They went across Kalia's yard. Kalia was in her high chair at the kitchen window. She waved her spoon at Bean. Bean waved back and put her fingers to her lips. Shh, she whispered. I wonder who Kalia is. I wonder how old she is. I wonder what she looks like. Finally, they came to Bean's own yard. The next chapter is called Bean's Backyard. You peek over. See if Nancy's there, said Bean. She might be in the yard looking for me. Ivy nodded and stood up. She could just see over the fence. I don't see anyone, she said. They're probably out looking for me, said Bean. She pictured her mom and Nancy with worried faces. I've been gone a long time. Let's go get the worms, said Ivy, pulling herself up and over the fence. Bean's backyard was a big rectangle. All right, try to imagine this yard. Make a picture in your brain. Such a good picture that maybe you could even draw a map of what you're imagining. Bean's backyard was a big rectangle. There was a nice part with flowers and neat grass, and then there was a messy part with lumpy grass and a trampoline and a playhouse that Bean had had since she was little. She could barely fit inside it anymore. There was stuff lying all over the messy part of the yard. Hula hoops and balls, arrows, shovels, buckets, and a broken stilt. Bean had really hurt herself that time. The worms were in the messy part of the yard, over next to the playhouse where the ground was wet. Ivy and Bean grabbed shovels and a bucket and got to work. At first, there was just a lot of mud. Then there was mud and a few worms. The more they dug, the more worms they found. 6, 10, 13 worms. The worms oozed and curled through the mud. Bean liked the way they were fat one second and then stretched out skinny the next. She and Ivy dug deeper and deeper until they had made a big muddy pit in the ground. It was almost 2 feet across, and water dribbled down the sides. Worms were squirming at the bottom of the pit, trying to get away. Bean felt a little sorry for them, but Ivy just picked him up and dumped him in the bucket. Bean thought of Nancy kicking and waggling, and she began dumping them in the bucket too. How many do we need? Asked Bean. The worms were piled on top of one another in the bottom of the bucket. Only 10, Ivy looked in. But the more worms we have, the harder Nancy will dance. All right, that's enough, said Bean. Poor worms. Okay, said Ivy. She looked toward Bean's house. Let's go see if your sister is home. Okay, but we'd better sneak, said Bean. You know what? I want to pause for a second because I really like this idea, and you might be able to do something like this for a writer's workshop. Look at how there's all this writing here, but then down on the bottom, Sophie Blackall, the illustrator, has just put in worms at the bottom of the page, like a border. So maybe next time you're writing a story and it has a lot of words and you don't have a lot of space, you could just make a little border with something from your story. Annie Burroughs was writing about worms, so Sophie Blackall, the illustrator, put them on the bottom. Bean's house was good for sneaking. At the back, there was a porch. If you crawled like a bug across the porch, you could look through a big window into the kitchen. The girls ran toward the bushes that grew next to Bean's porch, and they ducked down, hiding. Quietly, they began to creep up the stairs that led to the porch, and very quietly, they crawled across the floor. And then Bean heard a sound. She froze. There it was again. A sob. Someone was crying. Bean listened. It sounded like Nancy. Bean put her her hand on Ivy's arm and pointed to the window. They crawled to it and they peered in like spies. There was Nancy. She was sitting at the kitchen table. She was alone and she was crying. Bean got a funny feeling. Nancy was usually so bossy, so nosy, so sure she was right. It was actually weird to see her cry all alone. Maybe she's crying because she thinks you're lost, said Ivy. That's kind of nice. Bean didn't answer. She had never thought she could make Nancy cry. Suddenly, she felt a lump in her throat. She remembered that Nancy had let her snuggle into her bed when she'd had bad dreams about the spooky man. She remembered that Nancy had let her play with her glass animal sometimes, even after she had broken the starfish. There's that broken starfish. She remembered that Nancy had once bought her a coloring book, a fairy coloring book with her very own money. Bean looked at the tears rolling down Nancy's cheeks. Poor Nancy, Bean sniffed. Maybe she didn't want to put the dancing spell on her sister after all. Nancy said something. Bean couldn't hear it, but she was sure it was something about missing her. What? Asked Bean's mother from the other room. Everyone has them, Nancy shouted. Everyone but me. I'm the only one who has to wait. She began to cry harder. What? Bean pressed her face against the window. Her mother's voice said, We've talked about this 1,000,000 times. You can have them when you're 12. Even some of stupid Bean's friends have them, yelled Nancy. Suddenly, Bean knew what Nancy was crying about. She's not sad about me at all. She's crying about pierced ears, hissed Bean to Ivy. Bean got mad, really mad. She was even madder than she had been when Nancy tried to drag her into the house. Bean was so mad she forgot all about being sneaky. She stood up and banged on the window with her fist. You're a big turkey, she yelled at her sister. Nancy stared and then jumped up. Hey, Mom, Bean's back. Get in here. Get in here, Bean breath. She flashed out the back door before Bean could even begin to run. In 2 seconds flat, she had Bean by the arm, and she was pulling her into the door. Just wait till Mom gets hold of you, she was saying. You're going to be in so much trouble. Stop, yelled Ivy. She stood right in front of Nancy, waving her wand in Nancy's face. I command you to free Bean. Oh my gosh, she's commanding her like a witch. Uh-oh, do you think she's going to cast the spell? What are you imagining this looks like? This chapter is called The Spell. Nancy stopped dragging Bean across the porch, and she looked at Ivy. Who are you? She asked. Ivy smiled and slitted her eyes. With her white face and her red blood drops, she looked very witchy. It matters not. Free my friend, she hissed. Wow, thought Bean. She's really going for it. Nancy dropped Bean's arm and lifted one eyebrow, which was something she had just learned how to do and did all the time. What's that supposed to be? She asked in a snippy, grown-up way, looking at Ivy's wand. Ivy shook the wand in Nancy's face. This is your doom, Ivy said in a deep voice. It's a wand, said Bean, looking back and forth between Ivy and Nancy. She was really beginning to worry. Maybe Ivy was going for it too much. There's Ivy, and there's Nancy. With older sisters, you had to be able to say that you never meant what you said, that you were kidding the whole time. and Ivy didn't seem to know that. Nancy snorted. "It's a stick," she said. She looked at Ivy's robe and giggled. "Nice bathrobe, too. You guys are complete and total dweebs." Uh-oh. Bean looked at Ivy. Her cheeks were red under the white paint, and her eyes were glittering. She looked like she might cry. Suddenly, Bean felt furious. Before, she had been really mad, but now Nancy was making fun of Ivy, and that made Bean furious. Without even stopping to think about it, Bean reached into the bucket that she was still carrying. Okay, wait a minute. Think about that bucket. Imagine it. What's inside? She got a big handful of pink worms. For a second, they squiggled in her hand, and then she threw them right in Nancy's face. Some of them fell into Nancy's shirt. Some of them got stuck in her hair, but one landed on her eyebrow and wiggled there, trying to find some dirt. Nancy was so surprised that she just froze. She just stood there with her mouth open, staring at Bean. Calmly, Bean reached into the bucket again, and she got another handful of worms, and she aimed better this time. She got a worm in Nancy's mouth. The pink worm went flying as Nancy spit it out. There was a tiny moment of quiet, and then she opened her mouth wide, and she let out a giant scream. There's Nancy with all the worms on her. Bean and Ivy looked at each other and smiled. "Whatever happens next," their eyes said. It was worth it, and they both began to run. Nancy tore after them, still screaming. Bean zigzagged across the lawn because she knew it was harder to catch someone who was zigzagging. Ivy zigzagged too, right behind Bean. "Worms! Worms!" Nancy was screaming. She had lost her mind. Ah! Bean could hear her mother calling. "What on earth? Girls! Girls!" Bean and Ivy ran around the trampoline with Nancy close behind. They jumped over the hula hoops and the stilt, and they headed for the trees, and Nancy followed them, still screaming. She was right behind them. She was so close that she could almost grab the soft folds of Ivy's robe, and she was just about to get it. "Help!" squealed Ivy. Bean gave it a yank and pulled the robe away just in the nick of time. Ivy and Bean swerved for the playhouse. Maybe they could get inside before Nancy tackled them. "Come on!" Bean yelled, and together they jumped over the worm pit, squeezed into the playhouse, and slammed the door. "Whew!" they said together. Then it happened. Nancy was still chasing them. She was running right toward the playhouse and toward the worm pit, the big, muddy worm pit. Ivy and Bean knew it was there, but Nancy didn't. She didn't see it at all. Readers, are you picturing this? Do you think you know what's going to happen? Can you imagine Nancy running toward the playhouse, but coming to the worm pit first? What does it look like in your mind? She charged toward the playhouse, and then, whoops! Her foot landed on the side of the muddy pit. Ivy and Bean looked out the playhouse window, and they saw Nancy skidding on the slimy edge of the hole. "Ah!" screamed Nancy. Back and forth she wobbled, trying to get her balance. She kicked one foot. She waved her arms wildly. She kicked her other foot. She waved. It was perfect. "She's dancing!" yelled Bean. "My spell worked!" cried Ivy. And just then, With a sloppy, gloopy thud, Nancy slipped off the edge and landed in the muddy goo at the bottom of the worm pit. Here comes the last chapter. It's called No Dessert. No dessert, said Bean. No videos for a week, but at least they didn't make me stay in my room. Ivy was sitting next to Bean on her front porch. It was almost dark. They watched the bugs flying around the streetlight. I don't think they're really mad, said Ivy. You don't? They had seemed pretty mad to Bean. I think Nancy was mad. They have to act mad so they'll seem fair to your sister, Ivy said. But your mom had this teeny tiny smile on her face when she pulled Nancy out of the mud pit. I think she thought it was funny. Bean smiled too, remembering. It was funny. It was great, said Ivy. Nancy says she's never going to speak to either one of us ever again, and she even took back the coloring book she gave me. Well, she never spoke to me before today, so that won't be any different for me. It's going to be better for me, said Bean. But I bet she doesn't stick to it. Bean yawned. It had been a big day. She turned to Ivy. Do you think the spell is what made her dance? Of course. Ivy sounded very sure. But after a minute she said, I didn't really have time to say the spell. I just sort of thought it at the very last second. Bean stared into the shadowy yard. Maybe that's why she didn't dance for very long, because you only thought the spell instead of saying it. Next time I'll say it, said Ivy. You're going to do it again? On who? Bean asked. I was thinking about maybe Mrs. Trance, said Ivy. Bean pictured Miss Trance kicking up her feet at the edge of a muddy pit. Can you picture that? Miss Trance at the end of a muddy pit, about to fall in where all the worms and goo are. It would be a beautiful sight. Hey, can you teach me how to burp like that? Asked Bean. Sure, said Ivy. Maybe I'll try something new on Miss Trance, like a storm of grasshoppers. Ooh, is that a hard spell? Asked Bean. No, but we have to start with a lot of grasshoppers, said Ivy. It seems like all these spells have bugs in them, said Bean. Not all of them, said Ivy. Potions don't. Potions. That sounded like fun. Let's make a potion, Bean said. Okay, said Ivy. Tomorrow we'll make potions. I know what, said Bean. Tomorrow let's fix up a lab in your room. Then we can make potions. She was picturing a lab with shelves full of little bottles. Can you picture that too? She and Bean would have to wear goggles. Ivy stood up straighter. Yeah, that'll be good. We'll dump the dressing room and we'll get some shelves. Shelves with little bottles and maybe a counter. Bean? Bean's mother came to the front porch. There you are. It's almost bath time. Ivy, do you want me to walk you home? Okay, said Ivy. But Bean's mom sat down beside Bean and looked at the nighttime sky. You girls have certainly had a big day, haven't you? Bean leaned against her mother's arm. Tomorrow we're going to make a lab in Ivy's room. Oh, you are you? Said Bean's mom. What for? Potions, said Ivy. What kind of potions? Asked Bean's mom. Secret potions, said Ivy. There was a silence. And Bean's mom said, no matches, no poison, no explosions, no deadly fumes, no bugging Nancy. Am I making myself clear? Ivy and Bean looked at each other and rolled their eyes. Weren't you the one who was always telling me to play with Ivy? Said Bean. Wasn't this your idea in the first place, Mom? Bean's mother smiled at them in the dark. The light on Ivy's porch came on and Ivy's mom stepped into the street. She waved. Time to come in, honey. Down the stairs and across the circle, She came into the moonlight. Ivy stood up, and so did Bean. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow. And then the day after that, Bean added in her mind. Ivy, holding her mother's hand in the middle of the street, turned to look at Bean. And the day after that, said Ivy. And that is the end. I really hope that you enjoy this story. There are many more books to come. The next one is actually called Ivy and Bean and Ivy and Bean and the Ghost That Had to Go. See you later.